Hey there! Tonight, we're exploring one of the most hyped technologies of the 21st century electric vehicles and their revolutionary battery technology. But forget everything you've heard about Tesla changing the world, about how EVs are the inevitable future, or about how battery breakthroughs are just around the corner. We're about to discover the reality that electric cars aren't new at all, that they were actually more popular than gasoline cars over a century ago, and that they failed for exactly the same reasons they struggle today. Batteries are heavy, expensive, short-ranged, and take forever to recharge. With a century of research barely moving the needle on these fundamental limitations. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in New York City at the turn of the 20th century. And the first thing you notice isn't the horse-drawn carriages or the primitive roads, but rather that electric cars are everywhere, significantly outnumbering the noisy, unreliable gasoline automobiles that are just beginning to appear on city streets. Electric vehicles aren't a futuristic dream. They're the dominant automotive technology of the day, accounting for about a third of all vehicles on American roads. The second thing you notice is that your electric car, which seemed so advanced just moments ago, has a 2,000-pound lead-acid battery pack that gives you maybe 40 miles of range on a good day and needs to be replaced every few years at a cost that's roughly equivalent to buying an entirely new gasoline car. Your electric vehicle is parked outside a wealthy home in Manhattan, which is the only place where electric cars make any sense because you need both the money to afford one and access to electricity for charging, which most Americans don't have. The car itself is elegant and quiet, a stark contrast to the gasoline automobiles that require hand cranking to start, make terrible noises, and frequently break down. The electric car starts instantly, runs silently, and requires minimal maintenance compared to gasoline vehicles that need constant attention to their finicky engines. The early EV superiority that you're experiencing represents a genuine technological advantage that electric vehicles had over gasoline cars in the early 1900s. Electric cars were cleaner, yetter, easier to operate, and more reliable than gasoline vehicles that were difficult to start, required manual transmission operation that many people found challenging, and broke down frequently. For wealthy urban residents, electric cars were clearly the better choice, which explains why they dominated the early automotive market. The initial dominance of electric vehicles in the early 20th century demonstrates that EVs aren't a new invention, but are actually older than the gasoline automobile industry that eventually displaced them. Electric cars were commercially successful decades before Henry Ford's Model T transformed gasoline vehicles into affordable mass-market products, showing that the competition between electric and gasoline power isn't a recent development, but is a century-old debate. The wealthy urban market that electric vehicles served included doctors making house calls, society, women who wanted quiet, clean transportation, and affluent families who could afford the premium prices that electric cars commanded. The vehicles were status symbols that demonstrated wealth and sophistication, much like Tesla's appeal to wealthy early adopters over a century later. The lead-acid limitations that your electric car suffers from represent the fundamental problem that would eventually kill the first electric vehicle era, and that continues to plague EVs today. The battery technology that powers your car is essentially the same chemistry used in modern car batteries for starting gasoline engines, except you're using it to power the entire vehicle. which requires enormous battery packs that consume most of the car's weight and volume. The massive weight of lead-acid batteries creates a vicious cycle where more batteries are needed to provide acceptable range. But adding batteries increases weight, which reduces efficiency and requires even more batteries. Your electric car carries approximately 2,000 pounds of batteries to achieve 40 miles of range, meaning the battery weighs more than the rest of the car combined and provides performance that's barely adequate for city driving. The short range that 40 miles represents sounds perhaps acceptable for urban driving until you realize that this is optimal range under ideal conditions. And that real-world usage in cold weather at higher speeds, or with battery degradation, can reduce range to 20 or 30 miles. The range makes electric cars useless for any trip beyond city limits and creates constant anxiety about whether you'll have enough charge to complete your journey. The charging infrastructure absence that characterizes the early 1900s means that electricity is only available in wealthy urban areas where power grids exist. And even there, charging facilities are rare outside private homes. The lack of infrastructure makes electric cars impractical for anyone who doesn't have a garage with electrical service, which excludes most Americans who live in rural areas or urban apartments. The home charging requirement that electric cars impose means that only homeowners with electrical service and garages can practically own EVs, creating a technology that's only accessible to a small fraction of the population. The requirement hasn't changed over a century, with modern EVs still being most practical for homeowners who can charge overnight. The battery replacement costs that electric car owners face represent one of the most economically devastating aspects of EV ownership. The lead-acid batteries that power your car will need to be replaced every few years at costs that approach or exceed the price of buying a new gasoline car, making the total cost of ownership far higher than gasoline vehicles, despite electricity being cheaper than gasoline. The ruinous expense of battery replacement creates a used car market where electric vehicles lose value catastrophically because potential buyers must factor in immediate battery replacement costs. The replacement cost problem persists over a century later with modern EVs, where out-of-warranty battery replacements can cost $20,000 or more. The performance degradation that batteries experience over time means that your 40-mile range is steadily declining as the battery ages, with capacity loss accelerating as the battery approaches end of life. The degradation creates a situation where the car becomes progressively less useful until it's eventually unusable, at which point you face the economically devastating battery replacement cost. The rapid capacity loss that lead-acid batteries experience comes from fundamental chemical processes that occur during charge and discharge cycles, with the degradation being inherent to the battery chemistry rather than being solvable through better engineering. The capacity loss means that electric cars have built-in obsolescence that gasoline cars don't face because fuel systems don't degrade in the same way. The winter failure that electric cars experience represents another fundamental limitation that plagues EVs to this day. When temperatures drop below freezing, chemical reactions in the battery slow dramatically, reducing available capacity by 30 to 50% and making the car nearly useless in cold climates. The winter performance degradation isn't a problem that can be engineered away because it's inherent to the electrochemistry of batteries. The cold weather impact creates situations where your 40-mile summer range becomes 20 miles in winter, making the car impractical for even short trips in cold weather. The impact explains why electric cars never gain traction in northern climates and why modern EVs still struggle with customer satisfaction in cold weather states. The competition from gasoline that ultimately kills the first electric vehicle era comes not from gasoline cars being initially better, but from gasoline technology improving while battery technology stagnates. Gasoline cars become more reliable, easier to operate, and significantly cheaper, while electric cars remain expensive, short-ranged, and dependent on batteries that don't meaningfully improve. The gasoline becoming cheaper and more convenient occurs as oil production increases and distribution networks expand, making gasoline available everywhere at low cost while electricity remains limited to urban areas. The infrastructure advantage that gasoline develops becomes insurmountable as gas stations appear throughout the country, while electric charging remains confined to private homes. The Model T revolution that Henry Ford launches transforms gasoline cars from expensive luxuries into affordable mass-market vehicles, with prices dropping to fractions of what electric cars cost. The price advantage makes gasoline cars accessible to middle-class Americans, while electric cars remain toys for the wealthy. The lead-acid chemistry problems that doom early electric vehicles include fundamental limitations that a century of research has failed to overcome. The chemistry is inherently inefficient. The batteries are unavoidably heavy, and the degradation is built into how the batteries function, rather than being an engineering problem that can be solved. The weight disaster that lead-acid chemistry creates stems from the fundamental fact that lead is extremely heavy and that large amounts are required to store meaningful energy. The weight can't be engineered away because it's inherent to using lead as the electrode material, making weight reduction impossible without completely changing to different battery chemistry. The sulfation issues that kill lead-acid batteries occur when lead sulfate crystals form during discharge and fail to completely dissolve during charging, gradually reducing battery capacity until the battery is useless. The sulfation is particularly problematic when batteries sit unused, making electric cars that aren't driven regularly suffer battery death even without being used. The acid hazards that lead-acid batteries present include highly corrosive sulfuric acid that can leak from damaged batteries and cause severe chemical burns. The acid makes battery maintenance dangerous and creates disposal problems because the acid is hazardous waste that can't simply be thrown away. The maintenance nightmare that lead-acid batteries require includes regularly adding distilled water to replace water lost during charging, cleaning corrosion from terminals, and monitoring charge levels to prevent damage. The maintenance requirements make electric cars more demanding than gasoline cars that require occasional oil changes but don't need weekly battery attention. The fire and explosion risks that lead-acid batteries create come from hydrogen gas that's generated during charging and that can accumulate in enclosed spaces and explode if ignited. The hydrogen risk makes charging in garages dangerous without adequate ventilation and creates safety concerns that gasoline cars with their inflammable fuel tanks also present but in different ways. The disposal toxicity that lead-acid batteries create represents an environmental disaster that's often overlooked in discussions of early electric vehicles. Lead is extremely toxic to humans and wildlife, and battery disposal contaminates soil and water with heavy metals that persist for centuries. The environmental cost of lead-acid batteries undermines any claim that early electric vehicles were environmentally friendly. The economic unsustainability that dooms first-generation electric vehicles stems from costs that far exceed what middle-class Americans can afford, combined with operating expenses that make EVs more expensive than gasoline cars over their lifetime. The economics work only for wealthy urban residents who can afford both the purchase price and the battery replacement costs, making EVs a niche product rather than mass-market transportation. The initial cost premium that electric vehicles command prices them out of reach for average consumers who can buy gasoline cars for fractions of what electric cars cost. The premium reflects the expensive batteries and limited production volumes that prevent economies of scale from reducing costs. The operating expenses that accumulate over time include battery replacements that can exceed the cost of buying new gasoline cars, making the total cost of ownership far higher than the purchase price suggests. The expenses surprise buyers who focus on initial costs without considering long-term battery replacement requirements. The depreciation disaster that electric cars experience creates used car markets where EVs lose value far faster than gasoline cars because used car buyers rationally fear imminent battery replacement costs. The depreciation makes electric cars poor financial investments that lose most of their value within a few years. As your first week in early electric vehicle history ends, you understand that everything being marketed as revolutionary about modern EVs isn't new at all. That the same fundamental battery limitations that killed electric cars a century ago still persist today. And that the problems aren't engineering challenges that can be solved, but are physical limitations inherent to battery chemistry that constrain what's possible regardless of technological advancement. Tonight, you'll sleep in a world where electric cars are about to lose the competition with gasoline vehicles, not because of conspiracy or lack of innovation, but because batteries are fundamentally unsuited for powering automobiles in ways that century of research hasn't overcome. Tomorrow will bring more evidence that the history of electric vehicles is a history of persistent failure interrupted by periodic waves of hype that ignore the fundamental problems. Welcome to the reality of electric car batteries, where a century separates early lead-acid vehicles from modern lithium-ion cars, but the fundamental problems of weight, cost, range, and charging time remain essentially unchanged, despite massive research investments and optimistic promises that breakthroughs are just around the corner. Your second week in electric vehicle history begins not in the optimistic early 1900s, but in the 1990s. When you've time jumped forward almost a century to discover that electric cars have essentially disappeared from American roads during the intervening decades. The century between your last experience and now has seen repeated attempts to revive electric vehicles. Each one promising that new battery technology has finally solved the problems that killed the first EV era. And each one failing for fundamentally the same reasons, while generating briefly intense enthusiasm, followed by inevitable disappointment and abandonment. The morning starts with exciting news that General Motors is launching a revolutionary electric vehicle called the EV1 that supposedly represents the future of transportation. The car features advanced nickel metal hydride batteries that provide dramatically better performance than lead-acid technology, with GM claiming ranges of up to 80 miles and performance that rivals gasoline cars. The enthusiasm surrounding the EV1 launch feels familiar because it's essentially the same enthusiasm that surrounded electric cars in the early 1900s, with people convincing themselves that this time will be different, even though the fundamental problems haven't actually been solved. The NICAD and NIMH disappointments that characterize 1990s electric vehicle attempts represent the first major effort to revive EVs using battery chemistries that were genuinely superior to lead-acid, but that still suffered from limitations that made electric cars impractical for most users. The new batteries were lighter, more efficient, and longer-lasting than lead-acid. But they were also more expensive and still couldn't provide the range, recharging speed, or cost-effectiveness that would make electric cars competitive with gasoline vehicles. The 1990s promises that accompanied the introduction of nickel-cadmium and nickel metal hydride batteries involved claims that electric vehicles were finally ready for mainstream adoption and that the battery technology problems that had plagued earlier attempts were now solved. The promises sound remarkably similar to claims made about lithium-ion batteries decades later, suggesting that optimistic forecasts about battery breakthroughs are a recurring pattern rather than accurate predictions. The supposed solutions that new battery chemistries provided included higher energy density that reduced weight for equivalent range, better cold weather performance than lead-acid, and improved cycle life that promised to reduce replacement costs. The improvements were real, but were insufficient to overcome the fundamental limitations that made electric cars impractical for mass-market adoption. The GM EV1 failure that you're witnessing represents the most prominent attempt to create a mass-market electric vehicle in the 1990s. With General Motors investing heavily in developing a purpose-built electric car rather than simply converting existing gasoline vehicles, the EV1 was genuinely innovative, featuring aerodynamic design, lightweight construction, and the best battery technology available. But it still couldn't overcome the fundamental economics and usability problems that doomed electric cars. The expensive lease-only model that GM used for the EV1 meant that customers couldn't actually buy the cars, but could only lease them for monthly payments that exceeded what most people paid for gasoline car leases. The lease-only approach was motivated partly by GM's concerns about battery longevity and replacement costs, with the company wanting to maintain control over vehicles whose long-term costs were uncertain. The limited production that characterized the EV1 program reflected GM's understanding that electric cars weren't ready for mass-market production, and that the program was essentially a compliance exercise to satisfy California's zero-emission vehicle mandate, rather than a genuine attempt to transform the automotive industry. The production numbers maxed out at around 1,000 vehicles annually, demonstrating that GM never believed EVs were viable. The Toyota RAV4 EV that represented another prominent 1990s electric vehicle program followed similar patterns to the EV1, with limited production, high costs, and eventual discontinuation after Toyota concluded that battery limitations made EVs impractical. The RAV4 EV used nickel metal hydride batteries from a partnership with Tesla precursor AC Propulsion, demonstrating that even the best available battery technology couldn't make EVs economically viable. The limited production numbers for the RAV4 EV totaled fewer than 2,000 vehicles over several years, with Toyota treating the program as a California compliance exercise rather than a serious product line. The limited production reflected rational business calculation that EVs couldn't be sold profitably and that customer demand was insufficient to justify mass production. The discontinuation that ended the RAV4 EV program occurred when California weakened its zero-emission vehicle mandate, eliminating the regulatory pressure that had motivated Toyota to produce electric cars that lost money on every sale. The discontinuation demonstrated that EV programs of the 1990s existed primarily to satisfy regulations rather than to serve genuine market demand. The battery lifespan issues that plagued 1990s electric vehicles included degradation that reduced range over time and eventual battery failures that required expensive replacements. The nickel metal hydride batteries used in the EV1 and RAV4 EV were more durable than lead acid, but still had finite lifespans that created the same economic problems that killed earlier electric vehicles. The expensive replacement costs for NIMH battery packs meant that even after spending premium prices to lease or buy electric vehicles, owners faced potential replacement bills of $10,000 or more when batteries eventually failed. The replacement costs made EVs economically irrational for most consumers, who could buy reliable used gasoline cars for less than the cost of replacing an EV battery. The memory effect that particularly plagued nickel-cadmium batteries involved a phenomenon where batteries that were repeatedly recharged without being fully discharged would remember the shorter discharge cycle and lose capacity accordingly. The memory effect meant that users had to carefully manage charging patterns to maintain battery performance, creating additional complexity that gasoline cars didn't require. The capacity loss from memory effect could be partially reversed through full discharge cycles. But the management requirements made NiCad batteries more demanding than nickel metal hydride alternatives that suffered less from memory effect. The problem demonstrated that even improved battery chemistries came with their own limitations and complications that made EVs more difficult to own than gasoline cars. The crushing of the EV1s that occurred when GM recalled and destroyed nearly all of the vehicles became the center of controversy and conspiracy theories about automotive industry suppression of electric vehicle technology. The dramatic images of EV1s being crushed and shredded fed narratives about oil companies and car manufacturers conspiring to kill electric cars that were supposedly ready for mass adoption. The literal destruction of vehicles that GM had leased to customers seemed suspicious and generated substantial backlash from EV enthusiasts who wanted to buy their leased vehicles but were refused. The crushing became symbolic of industry resistance to electric vehicles, though GM's motivations were more prosaic than conspiratorial. The oil company conspiracy myths that emerged from the EV1 program's cancellation gained widespread attention through the documentary Who Killed the Electric Car, which suggested that electric vehicles were deliberately suppressed by oil companies and auto manufacturers who feared losing profits from gasoline sales. The conspiracy narrative was compelling, but oversimplified the complex reasons why electric vehicles failed to gain mass market adoption in the 1990s. The documentary claims that characterized Who Killed the Electric Car placed primary blame on automotive and oil industry conspiracies, while downplaying the genuine technical and economic limitations that made electric vehicles impractical for most consumers. The film resonated with people who wanted to believe that EVs were ready for mass adoption and that only corporate greed prevented their success. The reality check that conspiracy theories ignore involves acknowledging that electric vehicles in the 1990s genuinely weren't ready for mass market adoption due to battery limitations that made them expensive, short-ranged, and impractical for most users. The vehicles failed primarily because of technical and economic problems rather than because of industry conspiracy. The battery limitations that genuinely killed 1990s electric vehicles included insufficient range for most users' needs, high costs that made EVs economically irrational, long charging times that made EVs impractical for spontaneous trips, and battery degradation that created uncertain long-term costs. These limitations were real technological constraints rather than artificial barriers created by conspiracy. The consumer rejection that doomed EV programs reflected rational calculation by most consumers that electric vehicles didn't serve their needs and weren't worth the premium prices and operational compromises they required. The small number of enthusiasts who wanted EVs wasn't sufficient market to justify mass production of vehicles that lost money on every sale. The infrastructure absence that made EVs impractical in the 1990s included lack of public charging stations, inconsistent home charging options for apartment dwellers, and the reality that most Americans couldn't charge vehicles where they lived. The infrastructure problems were acknowledged but unsolved because building charging networks required enormous investment without clear paths to profitability. The lithium-ion hype cycle that begins in the 2000s represents the next wave of battery technology promises. With lithium-ion chemistry migrating from consumer electronics into automotive applications and generating claims that this technology would finally make electric vehicles practical. The hype follows familiar patterns, where new battery chemistry generates enthusiasm and predictions of imminent EV revolution. The laptop battery origins of automotive lithium-ion technology involved chemistry that had been developed for powering portable electronics, but that required significant scaling and modification to work in vehicles. The scaling from powering laptops for a few hours to powering cars for hundreds of miles represented an enormous engineering challenge that early lithium-ion EV proponents significantly underestimated. The consumer electronics success that lithium-ion batteries achieved in laptops and phones demonstrated that the chemistry could provide high energy density and long cycle life in small-scale applications, creating optimism that the same technology could revolutionize electric vehicles. The optimism underestimated how different automotive requirements were from consumer electronics. The scaling problems that emerged when attempting to use lithium-ion batteries in vehicles included thermal management challenges, safety concerns, cost issues, and the reality that automotive applications required orders of magnitude more energy storage than laptop batteries provided. The scaling wasn't simply a matter of using more cells, but required solving new problems that didn't exist at smaller scales. The automotive applications being different magnitude than consumer electronics meant that techniques that worked for laptop batteries couldn't simply be scaled up to vehicle size. The thermal management, safety systems, and battery management electronics required for automotive use added enormous complexity and cost beyond what consumer electronics batteries needed. The cost prohibitions that initially made lithium-ion batteries unsuitable for vehicles included battery packs that cost more than entire gasoline cars. making EVs economically absurd for anyone prioritizing value over environmental or performance factors. The costs would decline over time, but remain the primary barrier to mass EV adoption. The batteries costing more than gas cars demonstrated how far lithium-ion technology was from being ready for mainstream automotive use, with early battery packs costing $30,000 or more for vehicles that still had limited range and long charging times. The costs made early lithium-ion EVs toys for wealthy early adopters rather than practical transportation for average consumers. The safety concerns that accompanied early automotive lithium-ion adoption included numerous incidents of laptop and phone batteries catching fire due to internal short circuits or damage, raising questions about whether lithium-ion chemistry was safe enough for automotive use, where batteries would experience more extreme conditions, and where fires would be more dangerous. The Sony laptop battery recalls that occurred due to fire risks demonstrated that lithium-ion chemistry had genuine safety problems that needed to be addressed before widespread automotive adoption. The recalls involved millions of batteries and highlighted how lithium-ion's high energy density came with increased fire risk if batteries were damaged or defectively manufactured. The thermal management requirements that lithium-ion batteries imposed meant that electric vehicles needed complex cooling systems to prevent batteries from overheating during operation or charging. The cooling systems added cost, weight, and complexity while creating new potential failure modes that could damage expensive battery packs. The government subsidy dependence that characterized electric vehicle sales from the 1990s onward demonstrated that EVs couldn't compete with gasoline cars without massive taxpayer subsidies to offset their higher costs. The subsidies made EVs economically viable for some buyers, but raised questions about sustainability of business models dependent on government support. The tax credits that federal and state governments offered for EV purchases included thousands of dollars in direct subsidies that reduced the effective purchase price below sticker price, making EVs affordable for buyers who wouldn't pay full price. The credits represented wealth transfers from taxpayers to generally affluent EV buyers who could afford expensive vehicles even without subsidies. As your second week ends, you understand that the century between the first EV era and modern electric vehicles saw repeated cycles of optimism and failure, with each new battery technology generating claims that EVs were finally ready for mainstream adoption before technical and economic realities forced acknowledgement that fundamental problems remained unsolved. The pattern suggests that battery limitations are persistent rather than temporary challenges. Tonight, you'll sleep knowing tomorrow brings news of the Tesla Roadster and claims that lithium-ion batteries have finally made EVs practical. Even though the patterns you've witnessed suggest this will be another wave of hype followed by recognition of continuing limitations. The century of false starts teaches that battery improvements are incremental rather than revolutionary. Your third week in electric vehicle history begins with the announcement that a Silicon Valley startup called Tesla Motors is launching an electric sports car that will supposedly prove electric vehicles are ready for mainstream adoption. The company's founder, Elon Musk, is making extraordinary claims about how Tesla will revolutionize transportation and save the planet from climate change, while conveniently omitting that the car will cost over $100,000, will be built using thousands of commodity laptop battery cells, and will be manufactured in such small quantities that it represents a boutique luxury product rather than a genuine solution to automotive emissions. The hype surrounding Tesla feels familiar because it follows the same pattern of optimistic claims that have accompanied every previous attempt to revive electric vehicles. Except this time, the marketing is more sophisticated and the Silicon Valley connections give the promises more credibility than they deserve. The morning starts with Tesla unveiling the Roadster, a sports car built on a Lotus chassis and powered by 831 lithium-ion battery cells that are literally the same cells used in laptop computers. The vehicle accelerates impressively, looks attractive, and generates tremendous enthusiasm from tech enthusiasts and environmentalists who want to believe that electric vehicles are finally ready for prime time. What the enthusiastic coverage fails to emphasize is that the Roadster costs more than most people's houses, that only a few thousand will be built over several years, and that the vehicle represents a proof of concept rather than a practical transportation solution for anyone beyond wealthy early adopters who can afford six-figure toys. The Roadster, representing laptop batteries on wheels, isn't a criticism from skeptics. It's literally the technical reality of how Tesla built the car. The company used commodity 18650 lithium-ion cells from laptop battery manufacturers and packaged them into automotive battery packs, creating a vehicle powered by the same technology that ran portable computers except scaled up to thousands of cells. The approach was clever from an engineering standpoint, but demonstrated that Tesla wasn't developing revolutionary battery technology, but was simply repurposing existing consumer electronics batteries for automotive use. The $100,000 plus price tag that the Roadster commanded priced the vehicle out of reach for everyone except wealthy enthusiasts who wanted the latest technology regardless of cost. The pricing reflected the reality that even using commodity laptop batteries, creating an electric sports car required enormous costs for the battery pack, specialized manufacturing, and limited production volumes that prevented economies of scale from reducing prices. The wealthy-only market that the Roadster served included tech executives, celebrities, and affluent early adopters who viewed the car as a status symbol and technology demonstration rather than as practical transportation. The market was similar to the wealthy urban residents who bought electric cars in the early 1900s, demonstrating that EVs remained luxury goods accessible only to rich consumers. The 831 laptop cells that powered the Roadster were arranged in a complex battery pack that required sophisticated thermal management, individual cell monitoring, and safety systems to prevent the kind of fires that occasionally occurred in laptop batteries from becoming catastrophic vehicle fires. The complexity demonstrated that using commodity cells required extensive engineering to make them safe and reliable in automotive applications. The literally commodity batteries that Tesla used weren't custom designed for automotive use, but were standard cells manufactured in high volumes for laptop computers and then purchased by Tesla for vehicle applications. The commodity approach allowed Tesla to benefit from electronics industry economies of scale, but meant that the company was dependent on battery suppliers and couldn't differentiate on battery technology. The fire risks that the Roadster faced included several high-profile incidents where vehicles caught fire after crashes or charging problems, demonstrating that lithium-ion batteries' high energy density came with genuine safety concerns. The fires received significant media attention and raised questions about whether electric vehicles were safe enough for widespread use. The multiple battery fires and crashes demonstrated that lithium-ion batteries could ignite when damaged, creating fires that were difficult to extinguish and that could reignite hours or days after appearing to be extinguished. The fire risk wasn't theoretical, but was a real safety concern that required sophisticated battery protection systems and raised insurance costs for electric vehicles. The limited production numbers for the Roadster totaled fewer than 500 vehicles over 4 years of production, demonstrating that Tesla's first vehicle was a boutique product rather than a mass-market automobile. The limited numbers reflected manufacturing challenges, high costs, and the reality that market demand for $100,000 electric sports cars was limited to a small number of wealthy enthusiasts. The hand-built manufacturing that characterized Roadster production meant that each vehicle required significant manual labor and that quality and consistency varied between vehicles. The hand-building approach was necessary for low-volume production, but demonstrated that Tesla hadn't solved the manufacturing challenges required for mass production of electric vehicles. The range anxiety that Roadster owners experienced, despite Tesla's claims of over 200 miles of range, reflected the reality that advertised range was best-case scenario that couldn't be achieved in real-world driving. The actual range varied dramatically based on driving speed, weather conditions, and battery age, creating the same range anxiety that had plagued electric vehicles for over a century. The real-world range disappointment occurred when owners discovered that highway driving, cold weather, or aggressive acceleration reduced range far below advertised figures. The disappointing range demonstrated that electric vehicle marketing systematically overstated what customers could expect in actual use. The charging time measured in hours meant that even with the fastest chargers available, Roadster owners needed to wait for extended periods to recharge their vehicles, making spontaneous road trips impractical and requiring careful planning for any drive beyond the limited range. The charging time represented a fundamental limitation that battery technology improvements hadn't overcome. The hours of waiting that charging required meant that electric vehicles couldn't be used the same way as gasoline cars, where refueling takes minutes, creating usage patterns where EVs worked for daily commuting but not for spontaneous longer trips. The charging limitation made EVs suitable only for owners who had other vehicles for trips beyond EV range. The battery degradation that Roadster owners experienced over time reduced range and performance as the thousands of laptop cells aged at different rates, and as the battery management system became less efficient, the degradation was inevitable with lithium-ion chemistry and created concerns about long-term vehicle value and eventual replacement costs. The expensive replacement that battery degradation eventually required cost tens of thousands of dollars for Roadster owners whose battery packs failed or degraded below acceptable performance levels. The replacement costs demonstrated that electric vehicles still suffered from the same economic problems that had plagued EVs since the lead-acid era. The Model S, representing Tesla's attempt to move from boutique sports cars to luxury sedans that could compete with premium gasoline vehicles, involved creating a larger, more practical vehicle that still commanded premium prices but offered more usability than the Roadster. The Model S generated enormous enthusiasm and established Tesla as a serious automotive manufacturer. But it didn't solve the fundamental problems that limited EV adoption. The luxury problem that the Model S represented involved Tesla creating expensive vehicles for wealthy buyers while claiming to be revolutionizing transportation for everyone. The contradiction between luxury pricing and mass market aspirations demonstrated that Tesla's actual business model was selling premium vehicles to affluent customers rather than making EVs accessible to average consumers. The $70,000 to $150,000 price range that the Model S commanded positioned it as a luxury vehicle competing with BMW, Mercedes, and other premium brands rather than as a mass-market transportation solution. The pricing reflected the reality that battery costs remained prohibitive and that Tesla couldn't build affordable electric vehicles profitably. The subsidy dependence that made Model S sales viable included federal tax credits of $7,500, plus additional state incentives that in some cases totaled over $10,000, representing massive taxpayer subsidies to generally wealthy buyers who could afford expensive vehicles without assistance. The subsidies raised questions about whether public money should subsidize luxury vehicle purchases. The environmental paradox of marketing luxury cars as green technology highlighted the contradiction in Tesla's positioning, where vehicles that cost more than most people's annual income and that were manufactured with significant environmental costs were promoted as environmental solutions. The paradox revealed that Tesla's environmental claims were marketing rather than genuine commitment to sustainability. The manufacturing quality issues that plagued early Model S production included panel gap problems, paint defects, door handle failures, and numerous other quality issues that would be unacceptable in vehicles costing half as much from traditional automakers. The quality problems demonstrated that Tesla was still learning how to manufacture cars at scale and that premium prices didn't guarantee premium quality. The panel gaps that became infamous involved misaligned body panels that created visible gaps between doors, hoods, and body panels. making expensive vehicles look poorly assembled. The gaps resulted from Tesla's inexperience with automotive manufacturing and from prioritizing production speed over quality control. The battery replacement costs for out-of-warranty Model S vehicles reached $20,000 or more, representing economically devastating expenses that destroyed used car values and created situations where battery replacement cost more than the entire vehicle was worth. The replacement costs demonstrated that electric vehicle economics remained fundamentally broken. The $20,000 battery packs that failed Model S owners represented the same economic disaster that had plagued electric vehicles since the lead-acid era, where battery replacement costs exceeded reasonable maintenance expenses and made EVs economically irrational for cost-conscious buyers. The supercharger network that Tesla built represented genuine innovation in charging infrastructure, but was economically unsustainable as a free service and created concerns about long-term viability. The network provided fast charging that made longer trips possible, but didn't solve the fundamental problem that charging still took far longer than refueling gasoline vehicles. The free charging that Tesla initially offered to Model S owners was clearly unsustainable economics that shifted charging costs from users to Tesla and ultimately to investors and later vehicle buyers. The free charging was marketing rather than viable business model and was eventually abandoned as Tesla recognized the costs couldn't be sustained. The depreciation acceleration that affected Tesla vehicles saw used Model S cars losing value far faster than comparable luxury gasoline vehicles, with vehicles losing 50% or more of their value within 3 to 4 years. The depreciation reflected concerns about battery longevity, technology obsolescence, and the reality that used EV markets were underdeveloped. The production hell that Tesla experienced when attempting to scale Model 3 manufacturing demonstrated that the company couldn't efficiently produce affordable electric vehicles, and that moving from low-volume luxury production to mass manufacturing presented challenges that nearly bankrupted the company. The production struggles revealed that Tesla's manufacturing capabilities were far behind traditional automakers. The Model 3 delays that extended for years behind promised timelines created situations where customers who paid deposits waited years for vehicles, with Tesla repeatedly missing production targets and pushing delivery dates further into the future. The delays demonstrated that Tesla had severely underestimated manufacturing challenges and had made promises it couldn't keep. The tent manufacturing that Tesla resorted to involved literally building cars in tents erected in parking lots when factory capacity proved insufficient, creating makeshift production lines that sacrificed quality for volume. The tent manufacturing became symbolic of Tesla's production struggles and desperation to meet delivery commitments. The quality control disasters that resulted from rushed production included vehicles delivered with missing parts, paint defects, misaligned panels, and numerous problems that required immediate service. The quality issues demonstrated that Tesla was delivering incomplete vehicles to meet production targets rather than ensuring vehicles met acceptable quality standards. The autopilot dangers that emerged as Tesla deployed semi-autonomous driving systems demonstrated that the company was using customers as beta testers for incomplete technology that contributed to fatal accidents. The autopilot marketing suggested capabilities that the system didn't have, creating situations where drivers over-relied on technology that wasn't ready for public deployment. The beta testing on public roads involved Tesla deploying autopilot and full self-driving features that were clearly incomplete and that required constant driver attention, while marketing suggested that the systems were more capable than they were. The approach used public roads as testing grounds without adequate safeguards. The fatal accidents that occurred when autopilot failed to detect obstacles or misinterpreted road conditions demonstrated that the technology wasn't ready for widespread deployment and that Tesla had prioritized marketing over safety. The deaths raised questions about whether Tesla should be allowed to continue using customers as test subjects. As your third week ends, You understand that Tesla hasn't solved the fundamental problems that have limited electric vehicle adoption for over a century, but has instead created luxury vehicles for wealthy buyers while using marketing genius in Silicon Valley. They're hyped to convince people that revolution is imminent. The reality is that EVs remain expensive, range limited, and suitable only for specific use cases rather than being ready to replace gasoline vehicles for most drivers. Tonight, you'll sleep knowing that tomorrow brings more Tesla promises about imminent breakthroughs, while the fundamental limitations of battery technology persist, and while the company's business model depends on government subsidies, stock market enthusiasm, and wealthy buyers who can afford premium prices for vehicles with significant compromises. Your fourth week in electric vehicle history brings the sobering realization that despite a century of battery research, billions in investment, and countless promises about imminent breakthroughs, the fundamental problems that made electric cars impractical in the early 1900s remain essentially unsolved today. You're experiencing modern electric vehicle ownership firsthand. And you're discovering that range anxiety is real and justified. That charging infrastructure is woefully inadequate. That the environmental costs of EV production are conveniently ignored by advocates. And that the total cost of ownership often exceeds gasoline vehicles when you account for depreciation, insurance, and eventual battery replacement. The reality contradicts the marketing that presents EVs as obviously superior to gasoline cars and reveals that electric vehicles work well for specific use cases but remain impractical for many drivers, regardless of how much technology improves. The morning starts with you planning a road trip in your electric vehicle and discovering that what would be a simple 3-hour drive in a gasoline car becomes a complex logistical challenge requiring careful planning of charging, stops, significant additional travel time, and constant anxiety about whether you'll have enough range to reach the next charger. The experience demonstrates that electric vehicles fundamentally change how you use cars, requiring planning and compromise that gasoline vehicles don't impose, and revealing that EVs aren't simply cleaner versions of gas cars, but are different tools with different capabilities and limitations. The range anxiety that electric vehicle ownership creates isn't irrational fear, but is justified concern based on real limitations of battery technology and charging infrastructure. The anxiety stems from knowing that running out of charge means being stranded in ways that running out of gas doesn't. Because you can't simply walk to a nearby station and bring back fuel in a container. The anxiety is compounded by range estimates that prove inaccurate in real-world conditions, and by the reality that you can't push an EV to its absolute range limit without risking expensive damage to the battery. The advertised versus actual range gap that characterizes electric vehicle marketing involves EPA estimates that are optimistically calculated under ideal conditions and that don't reflect what customers experience in real-world driving. The gap between advertised 300 miles and actual 200 miles creates disappointment and distrust when buyers discover their vehicles can't achieve promised range. The EPA ranges being optimistic reflects testing procedures that don't adequately account for highway speeds, climate control usage, or real-world driving patterns. The testing produces numbers that look good in marketing materials, but that mislead consumers about what they can expect from their vehicles. The cold weather impact that destroys electric vehicle range represents one of the most significant unresolved problems with battery technology. When temperatures drop below freezing, lithium-ion batteries lose 30 to 40% of their capacity because chemical reactions slow dramatically at low temperatures, making EVs nearly unusable in northern climates during winter months. The 40% range loss that occurs in winter means that your advertised 300-mile range becomes 180 miles in freezing weather, transforming a vehicle that seemed adequate into one that barely meets daily needs. The range loss isn't a minor inconvenience, but is a fundamental limitation that makes EVs impractical for many potential buyers. The highway speed efficiency that drops dramatically at 70 or 80 miles per hour demonstrates that EVs are optimized for city driving, where regenerative braking can recover energy. But they're inefficient at highway speeds where aerodynamic drag dominates and where batteries discharge rapidly. The efficiency loss means that highway trips consume range faster than city driving, creating situations where advertised range is impossible to achieve on road trips. The efficiency dropping on highways occurs because air resistance increases with the square of velocity, meaning that driving 80 miles per hour requires dramatically more power than driving 40 miles per hour. The physics can't be engineered away, making highway inefficiency an inherent limitation rather than a solvable engineering problem. The battery degradation that occurs over time steadily reduces available range, creating situations where vehicles that provided acceptable range when new become inadequate as batteries age. The degradation is inherent to lithium-ion chemistry and can't be prevented, only slowed through careful battery management that many owners don't understand or don't practice. The range declining over time means that buyers need to account for future degradation when evaluating whether an EV meets their needs, requiring them to purchase vehicles with more range than currently necessary to account for inevitable capacity loss. The degradation creates uncertainty about long-term vehicle utility and contributes to rapid depreciation. The charge planning requirement that EVs impose means that spontaneous trips aren't possible because you need to identify charging locations along your route, verify they're operational, and time your stops to allow for extended charging sessions. The planning burden makes EVs unsuitable for people who value flexibility and spontaneity in their transportation. The trip planning around chargers that EV ownership requires involves using apps to locate charging stations, checking real-time availability and functionality, and structuring your route around charging infrastructure rather than taking the most direct path. The planning adds complexity that gasoline vehicles don't require. The anxiety being constant among EV owners stems from always monitoring remaining range and mentally calculating whether you have sufficient charge to reach your destination plus a safety margin. The anxiety creates cognitive load that gasoline drivers don't experience because refueling is quick and gas stations are ubiquitous. The charging infrastructure inadequacy that plagues electric vehicle adoption represents a chicken and egg problem where insufficient charging infrastructure limits EV adoption. But low EV adoption doesn't justify investment in charging infrastructure. The inadequacy won't be solved without massive public investment that taxpayers may not support. The charger scarcity relative to gas stations reveals that charging infrastructure is nowhere near the density required to support mass EV adoption. While the United States has over 150,000 gas stations, there are only tens of thousands of public charging stations, and many of those are slow level 2 chargers rather than fast DC chargers. The nowhere near gas station density means that finding chargers requires planning, and that chargers are often located in inconvenient locations rather than on major travel routes. The scarcity creates range anxiety and limits EV utility for road trips. The broken chargers that plague charging networks represent a significant practical problem where apps show chargers that are non-functional, creating situations where drivers arrive at charging locations only to discover that chargers are broken and that the nearest alternative may be dozens of miles away. The broken charger problem reflects insufficient maintenance and lack of accountability in charging networks. The many non-functional chargers that EV drivers encounter demonstrate that charging infrastructure is less reliable than gas stations where pumps are consistently operational. The unreliability adds another layer of anxiety to EV ownership. The charging speed lies that characterize fast charging marketing involve claims of ultra-fast charging that still requires 30 to 45 minutes to reach 80% charge, with charging slowing dramatically after 80% to protect battery longevity. The fast charging is still 10 to 15 times slower than refueling gasoline vehicles. The fast charging still being 30 plus minutes means that road trips require extended stops that transform quick gas station visits into meal breaks or shopping trips. The time requirement makes EVs impractical for people who need to travel efficiently. The grid capacity concerns that emerge when considering mass EV adoption reveal that existing electrical infrastructure can't support millions of vehicles charging simultaneously without massive upgrades to generation and distribution systems. The upgrades would cost hundreds of billions and take decades to implement. The not enough electricity for mass adoption means that widespread EV use would require building new power plants and upgrading distribution networks at costs that may exceed the environmental benefits of electrifying transportation. The grid limitations represent a fundamental constraint on how quickly EVs can be adopted. The apartment impossibility that affects millions of Americans who live in multi-unit housing without dedicated parking demonstrates that EVs only work for homeowners with garages where overnight charging is possible. The limitation excludes large portions of the population from EV ownership regardless of vehicle improvements. The no-home charging for millions creates a situation where EVs remain accessible only to relatively affluent homeowners, while remaining impractical for renters and apartment dwellers who represent significant portions of urban populations. The limitation is infrastructure rather than technology. The environmental costs that EV production creates are systematically ignored by advocates who focus exclusively on tailpipe emissions, while ignoring the significant pollution created during vehicle and battery manufacturing. The full life cycle environmental impact of EVs is more complex than marketing suggests. The mining devastation that lithium and cobalt extraction causes includes massive open-pit mines, habitat destruction, water contamination, and ecosystem damage in regions where mining occurs. The environmental damage is significant and permanent. The lithium and cobalt extraction destroying environments occurs in countries like Chile, Argentina, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where mining operations cause water scarcity, toxic contamination, and social disruption. The damage undermines claims that EVs are environmentally friendly. The child labor in Congo cobalt mines represents an ethical disaster where the cobalt required for lithium-ion batteries is extracted using child workers in dangerous conditions. The child labor makes EV production morally problematic despite environmental marketing. The children mining cobalt work in hazardous conditions for minimal pay to extract materials that end up in batteries for luxury electric vehicles. The exploitation reveals that EV environmental benefits come at significant human costs. The water consumption that lithium mining requires threatens water supplies in arid regions where lithium deposits are located, creating conflicts between mining companies and local populations who depend on scarce water resources. The water usage is enormous and unsustainable. The lithium mining draining aquifers in Chile and Argentina creates long-term environmental damage and deprives local populations of water resources, demonstrating that EV production has significant environmental costs that are externalized to vulnerable populations. The CO2 from manufacturing that EV production generates exceeds emissions from gasoline car manufacturing because battery production is extremely energy intensive. Studies suggest that EVs need to be driven for years before their lower operating emissions offset higher manufacturing emissions. The EV production being more polluting than gas cars initially means that environmental benefits depend on vehicles being driven for extended periods, and that EVs driven short distances or powered by coal-generated electricity may never recover their manufacturing emission penalty. The electricity source that charges EVs determines their actual environmental impact. With EVs charged from coal plants potentially producing more emissions than efficient gasoline cars, the source matters enormously but is often ignored in environmental comparisons. The coal plants charging clean cars creates absurd situations where EVs are marketed as zero emission while being powered by the dirtiest form of electricity generation. The marketing ignores that emissions are simply moved from tailpipes to power plants. The total cost of ownership that realistic analysis reveals often favors gasoline vehicles when accounting for higher EV purchase prices. Faster depreciation, higher insurance costs, and eventual battery replacement expenses. The math challenges claims that EVs save money over vehicle lifetimes. The purchase price premium that EVs command can reach $10,000 to $15,000 compared to equivalent gasoline vehicles, requiring years of fuel savings to break even. The premium means EVs remain more expensive upfront despite potentially lower operating costs. The insurance costs for EVs exceed gasoline vehicle premiums because repair costs are higher. Replacement parts are expensive. And battery damage from accidents can total vehicles. The higher insurance partially offsets fuel savings. The depreciation disaster that affects EVs sees them losing value faster than gasoline vehicles because used car buyers fear battery replacement costs and because rapid technology changes make older EVs obsolete. The depreciation makes EVs poor financial investments. As your fourth week ends, you understand that the fundamental problems limiting electric vehicle adoption haven't been solved, but have simply been obscured through marketing that emphasizes strengths while ignoring weaknesses. Range anxiety is real. Charging infrastructure is inadequate. Environmental costs are significant. And economic analysis often favors gasoline vehicles, when honest accounting includes all costs. Tonight, you'll sleep knowing that EVs work well for specific use cases, particularly wealthy homeowners with short commutes and second vehicles for longer trips, but remain impractical for average Americans who can't afford premium vehicles and who need transportation that works for all purposes without requiring careful planning and significant compromises. Your fifth and final week doesn't begin in the past, but in the present day, where you've returned from your journey through electric vehicle history with a completely transformed understanding of how battery technology, despite over a century of development and decades of promises about revolutionary breakthroughs just around the corner, and has improved incrementally rather than transformationally. You're reading yet another article claiming that solid-state batteries will revolutionize electric vehicles within 5 years. And you finally recognize the pattern. These exact same promises have been made repeatedly for decades, with the timeline always staying 5 to 10 years in the future, regardless of how much time passes, suggesting that fundamental limitations constrain what's possible regardless of research, investment, or optimistic forecasts. You're sitting at your computer browsing automotive news, and every few weeks, there's another breathless announcement about a battery breakthrough that will supposedly solve all of electric vehicles' problems. The announcements follow a predictable pattern. University researchers or startup companies demonstrate prototype batteries with dramatically improved energy density, faster charging, or longer lifespan in laboratory conditions. And journalists extrapolate these lab results to predict that revolutionary EVs are imminent. What the articles consistently fail to mention is that laboratory prototypes almost never successfully scale to mass production, that previous breakthroughs announced with identical enthusiasm failed to materialize into commercial products, and that the gap between lab demonstrations and automotive-grade batteries is measured in decades rather than years. The solid-state battery promises that have dominated battery news for the past decade involve replacing the liquid electrolyte in lithium-ion batteries with solid materials that theoretically allow higher energy density, better safety, and longer lifespan. The promises sound compelling and have attracted billions in investment from automotive manufacturers desperate to improve EV competitiveness. But commercial solid-state batteries remain perpetually 5 years away despite decades of research and development. The decade of breakthroughs that have been announced regarding solid-state batteries includes countless press releases from companies and universities claiming to have solved various technical challenges and demonstrated work prototypes. Yet none have resulted in commercial products that consumers can actually purchase. The pattern of announcement without commercialization suggests that solid-state batteries face fundamental obstacles that press releases don't acknowledge. The always 5 years away timeline that characterizes solid-state battery predictions reveals how the technology has been perpetually on the verge of commercial availability since at least the early 2000s. With the promised arrival date consistently receding into the future as time passes. The persistent 5-year timeline suggests that optimistic predictions are marketing rather than realistic technological forecasting. The lab versus production gap that explains why battery breakthroughs don't reach consumers involves the enormous difference between demonstrating technology in controlled laboratory conditions with hand-built prototypes versus manufacturing millions of units consistently, safely, and affordably. The gap represents challenges that often prove insurmountable, despite what laboratory results suggest is possible. The prototypes never scaling reflects that batteries demonstrated in labs are often built using expensive materials, time-consuming processes, or techniques that can't be replicated in mass manufacturing. The prototypes prove concepts but don't prove viability for automotive applications requiring millions of batteries manufactured to strict quality and cost standards. The cost realities that solid-state batteries face include manufacturing expenses that exceed lithium-ion batteries by significant margins, making them economically impractical even if technical challenges could be solved. The cost problems reflect that solid-state batteries require expensive materials and manufacturing processes that may never achieve cost parity with lithium-ion technology. The even more expensive than lithium-ion projection for solid-state batteries means that they would make EVs even less affordable than current vehicles, potentially pushing electric cars further into the luxury market rather than making them accessible to average consumers. The economics suggest that solid-state batteries aren't the solution to EV adoption challenges. The manufacturing challenges that solid-state batteries present include difficulties producing solid electrolytes without defects, creating reliable interfaces between solid materials, and achieving consistent quality across millions of units. The challenges have proven more difficult than anticipated and may not be solvable at costs that enable commercial viability. The no mass production viable status that solid-state batteries maintain after decades of development demonstrates that the technology faces fundamental obstacles beyond what incremental improvements can address. The lack of progress suggests that solid-state batteries may never achieve the commercial success that proponents predict. The timeline extensions that repeatedly push solid-state battery commercialization further into the future reflect the reality that companies consistently underestimate technical challenges and overestimate their ability to solve them. The extensions erode credibility and suggest that promised timelines are marketing rather than engineering projections. The promises, constantly extending into the future, create a situation where solid-state batteries have been 5 years away for 15 years. With each delay attributed to unexpected technical challenges that require additional time to solve. The pattern suggests that fundamental limitations may prevent solid-state batteries from ever achieving commercial viability. The hydrogen's persistent appeal as an alternative to battery electric vehicles reflects recognition that batteries have inherent limitations that hydrogen fuel cells might avoid, offering quick refueling and long range while still producing zero emissions. The hydrogen alternative has attracted investment from manufacturers like Toyota, who believe that fuel cells may ultimately prove more practical than batteries for many applications. The fuel cell advantages over batteries include refueling times comparable to gasoline vehicles and energy storage that doesn't degrade like batteries, creating vehicles that behave more like traditional cars than battery electric vehicles do. The advantages explain why hydrogen technology persists despite infrastructure challenges. The quick refueling that hydrogen provides means that fuel cell vehicles can be refilled in minutes rather than requiring the extended charging times that battery electric vehicles need, eliminating one of EV's most significant practical limitations. The refueling advantage makes hydrogen attractive for applications where charging time is problematic. The long range that hydrogen fuel cells can provide exceeds what battery electric vehicles achieve. with some fuel cell vehicles offering over 300 miles of range without the weight penalties that battery packs impose. The range advantage demonstrates that hydrogen solves problems batteries. The infrastructure problems that hydrogen faces actually exceed battery electric vehicle charging challenges, with essentially no hydrogen refueling stations existing outside limited regions in California and a few other areas. The infrastructure absence makes hydrogen vehicles impractical for most consumers, regardless of their technical advantages. The even worse than EV charging infrastructure reality means that hydrogen vehicle owners have far fewer refueling options than EV owners have charging options, creating practical limitations that prevent hydrogen adoption despite theoretical advantages. The infrastructure deficit would require hundreds of billions in investment to address the efficiency losses that hydrogen creates through production, compression, transport, and conversion back to electricity mean that fuel cell vehicles consume far more primary energy than battery electric vehicles. For equivalent mileage, the efficiency problems make hydrogen economically and environmentally questionable even if infrastructure could be built. The energy conversion wasting power occurs at every stage of the hydrogen pathway, with electrolysis to produce hydrogen, compression for storage, transport to refueling stations, and fuel cell conversion, all creating losses that mean hydrogen vehicles require 2 to 3 times more primary energy than battery electric vehicles. The inefficiency undermines environmental benefits. The cost prohibitions that affect hydrogen include expensive fuel cell systems, costly hydrogen production, and the reality that hydrogen fuel costs significantly more than electricity per mile traveled. The costs make hydrogen vehicles economically challenging, even for enthusiasts willing to accept infrastructure limitations. The hydrogen being expensive to produce reflects that most hydrogen currently comes from natural gas reformation, rather than clean electrolysis, creating emissions that undermine environmental benefits, and that clean hydrogen production requires enormous amounts of electricity that might be better used charging battery electric vehicles directly. The Toyota commitment to hydrogen fuel cells represented by the Mirai and continued investment in fuel cell technology demonstrates that at least one major automaker believes hydrogen may ultimately prove more practical than batteries. But sales figures suggest that consumers disagree. The Mirai has sold in minuscule numbers compared to battery electric vehicles. The Mirai failing to gain adoption reflects infrastructure limitations, high costs, and consumer preference for battery electric vehicles, despite their limitations. The failure suggests that hydrogen may not overcome battery electric vehicles' market momentum even if technical advantages are real. The market reality check that contradicts electric vehicle hype involves sales data showing that EV adoption is slowing, that consumer resistance is growing as early adopters are satisfied and mainstream buyers remain skeptical, and that the transition to electric vehicles is progressing far more slowly than advocates predicted or governments mandated. The EV sales plateau that's occurring in many markets shows that after rapid growth driven by early adopters, electric vehicle sales are stalling as manufacturers struggle to find buyers beyond wealthy environmentalists and tech enthusiasts. The plateau suggests that current EVs don't meet mainstream consumer needs. The growth slowing dramatically indicates that the easy sales to enthusiastic early adopters have been captured, and that convincing mainstream consumers to buy EVs is proving far more difficult than the transition's early stages suggested. The slowing growth challenges predictions of rapid gasoline vehicle displacement. The unsold inventory that's accumulating at dealerships demonstrates that manufacturers are producing more EVs than consumers want to buy, creating situations where EVs sit unsold for months while gasoline vehicles continue selling quickly. The inventory buildup indicates that demand is far weaker than manufacturers anticipated. The dealers unable to move EVs despite incentives and discounts reveals that even with significant price reductions, many consumers prefer gasoline vehicles and view EVs as unsuitable for their needs. The dealer resistance suggests that market is rejecting EVs despite massive marketing campaigns. The consumer resistance that's hardening among mainstream buyers reflects realistic assessment of EV limitations. Concerns about charging infrastructure, skepticism about environmental claims, and preference for proven gasoline technology over electric vehicles that require compromises. The resistance suggests that EVs may remain niche products rather than achieving mass market dominance. The people choosing gas cars despite EV availability demonstrates that when consumers can choose freely rather than being forced by regulations or incentives, many rationally conclude that gasoline vehicles better serve their needs. The choices validate that EVs aren't obviously superior for all users. The subsidy reduction that's occurring as governments recognize the unsustainability of massive EV incentives removes artificial price advantages that made EVs competitive, revealing that without taxpayer support, electric vehicles can't compete with gasoline cars on economics alone. The subsidy reductions may stall EV adoption. The tax credits ending in many jurisdictions eliminates thousands of dollars in artificial price reductions, making EVs significantly more expensive and potentially pricing them out of reach for buyers who relied on subsidies to afford electric vehicles. The credit elimination tests whether EVs can succeed on their merits. The resale value collapse that's affecting used EVs creates situations where vehicles lose 60 to 70% of their value within 3 to 4 years, destroying the economic case for EV ownership and making leasing the only financially rational option. The collapse reflects concerns about battery degradation, technology obsolescence, and weak used EV demand. The used EV market being a disaster demonstrates that secondary buyers are even less interested in electric vehicles than new car buyers, creating situations where used EVs are nearly worthless because buyers fear expensive battery replacements and because newer EVs make older models obsolete. The used market collapse shows that EVs don't retain value like gasoline vehicles. As your final week ends, you understand that the electric vehicle future that's been promised for over a century keeps not arriving because battery technology faces fundamental limitations that incremental improvements can't overcome, because infrastructure requirements are far greater than acknowledged, and because most consumers rationally conclude that gasoline vehicles better serve their needs despite environmental marketing suggesting otherwise. Tonight, you'll sleep in a world where solid-state batteries remain 5 years away just as they have been for decades, where hydrogen infrastructure remains a pipe dream, where EV sales are plateauing as market reality intrudes on optimistic forecasts, and where the transition to electric vehicles is progressing far more slowly than governments and manufacturers hoped, suggesting that batteries' inherent limitations may prevent EVs from ever fully replacing gasoline vehicles. The tedious evolution of electric car batteries reveals that despite a century of development, batteries remain heavy, expensive, slow to charge, and limited in range, with improvements being incremental rather than revolutionary, and with fundamental physics constraining what's achievable regardless of research, investment, or technological optimism. Sweet dreams of realistic transportation planning that acknowledges technology limitations rather than assuming breakthroughs will solve all problems. Of energy policies that recognize EVs serve some needs, but not all. And of automotive markets that offer diverse solutions rather than forcing premature transitions to technologies that aren't ready for mass adoption. The journey from lead-acid batteries to lithium-ion technology represents a century of gradual improvement rather than revolutionary change. With electric vehicles in 2025 facing fundamentally the same limitations that killed them in 1925, insufficient range, inadequate infrastructure, high costs, and consumer preference for more practical alternatives that better serve diverse transportation needs. The volunteers and investors who believed in electric vehicle promises discovered that reality consistently disappoints relative to marketing. That battery breakthroughs remain perpetually just out of reach. And that incremental improvements can't overcome fundamental limitations that make electric vehicles suitable for some users but impractical for many others, regardless of how much technology advances.